Hello everyone, welcome. So this is the first ever video that I'm doing with me talking in it, so just bear with me if it's not 110% amazing. So what we're going to be going through today is I put up a post on Instagram a couple weeks ago just probing the question if anybody was interested in how I edit my images. So this is what we're going to be going through today. Alrighty, before we get straight into it, I thought I'd just explain the reason why I edit my images like this. The reason why is I'm just not super happy with the way that the Nikon RAW files come out, and I feel like you lose a little bit of your creative control with it. And also Lightroom imposes its own kind of settings on it, so we're going to be removing some of those. Not too many, but just kind of flattening out this image and making it nice. And where I got this idea from is editing my Blackmagic footage. Now the good thing with cinema camera footage is that it all comes out really flat, so you can just add in what you want rather than having to remove it or really try and balance it out to look nice. So it's really easy to make this stuff look nice. You just drop down the shadows and you can see where all the highlights already are. I don't need to do anything crazy, and that already looks nice, like just as it is, because we're starting off with a flat image and we're adding the information in. Alrighty, so the first thing that I look at when I'm taking the image is I want to make sure my highlights are protected, and that's the only real reason that I look at my histogram. Otherwise I don't really care too much about it. I do keep an eye on the shadows, but since I'm using a D810 I don't worry about it too much. For those of you that don't have this kind of camera system and you got something that doesn't have the same kind of dynamic range, what I used to do in the past is if there was going to be too much shadow clipping, I would take two images and then I would overlay them together, and that's how I would lift the shadows rather than trying to lift shadows where there wasn't enough information and you get the artifacting and all that horrible dirtiness in the shadows. So that's the thing that I look out for the most, is highlight protection. So let's just kind of get started. So the first thing that I start off with is I just reduce the contrast, and immediately we see most of those shadows start to disappear. We get kind of a nicer, flatter looking image already. Now what I'm looking at as well, in this case, I am looking at the histogram. We want to bring everything to the middle, so it's nice and even. So we have like a nice even distribution between shadows and highlights, enough for us to compress down and edit in. So the next thing that I'm probably going to look at here is I'm going to lift the blacks a little bit more so we can flatten it out more. Yep, that looks alright. Bring the whites down a little bit. So the whites, they're part of the highlights, so if you bring them down, it's going to flatten it even more. Now we're just going to raise that exposure a bit. Alrighty. So I'm just keeping a conscious eye on the highlights in those certain areas and just having a little bit of a look here to see if there's any blowouts happening. I don't usually mess too much with shadows and highlights, only in certain occasions would I do it. And I wouldn't touch them too much because they tend to absolutely ruin images. So unless it's absolutely necessary, do I touch them. So in this case, I'm going to play with them a little bit. Alrighty, and that's about as flat as I want it. I don't want to mess too much with the highlights and shadows because, as I said, that it really does tend to mess with the images a bit too much. Highlights, compressing that down too much really starts to make it super HDR-y, and we don't want to make it look HDR because that looks really awful. As I was mentioning before, we're going to be removing a couple of things, and in actual fact, it's not a couple of things, it's just one thing. So we're just going to be removing Lightroom's inbuilt sharpening that it just adds to images, because we don't really need that because we can add that in Photoshop, and it tends to add artifacting in places where it doesn't need sharpening. So if we're talking about the sky, for example, and we're doing this kind of edit, adding sharpening to places that there isn't anything to sharpen adds artifacting. So we just want to remove that altogether. And of course we want to add in our profile correction. If anybody's wondering what lens I'm using a 35mm Sigma f1.4. Most of my images are shot around f8. I try to keep my ISO as low as possible because that's where the yield is for the best dynamic range on my camera. On other cameras it can be a variety. Some cameras are 100, some are 400, so best to look up your specs and just see where your camera performs best. So now we're ready to export this into Photoshop. And I keep all of my images completely uncompressed. I leave it in the Adobe color space because that allows for a bit more color freedom and can stop color artifacts. Not completely, but it can help to prevent that from happening. So basically I'm just making the image as uncompressed as possible so that I have as much freedom as possible. So now that I've done that, I'm pretty happy with it. We're going to export it. And we're going to use a unique name because I don't want to overwrite old work. Alrighty, so now that we're in Photoshop, we're just going to take things from the top here. So first thing I do is I'm going to duplicate the layout. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this little method that I use from time to time, which is called apply image. And what we want to do is we want to make sure it's selected to the RGB channel, that's merged, and making sure we've got the right image selected. Sometimes Photoshop likes to select the other image you have open in Photoshop, so just make sure that you select the image correctly. And then we want to hit the mask option. Now, what this does is what I've found it does is it deepens colors, adds more threshold to highlights, and just kind of gives it a bit more of a flatter touch, and it allows us to kind of compress more in the next step. So the next step is the levels. Now in the levels, this is what I'm going to be compressing in. So we're going to start from the top. We're going to go from red. I'm just going to drag that up, and I'm holding Alt at the moment. So holding Alt allows me to see where the bleed's coming through, so where the highlights are clipping. So this is a really good tool because it allows you to see exactly what's going on with your image. And so this is shadows, and this is highlights. So this allows me to see what's going on. So 34, 163. I'm just going to bear these two numbers in mind when I'm going through it, because you want to make these numbers add up with the green and the blue, otherwise you get too much of one other color, unless it's intended for you to have more red or more blue or more green. So in my case I like neutral, so I'm going to be bearing these numbers in mind. So 34 and 163. Alright, and that comes out really nice and saturated and very low of contrast. The good thing here though is that if you find that this is way too much contrast or way too much saturation for you, it's easy enough to just desaturate it, and you can do that just by easily going back through this and dropping it down. So if we go to 29 on all of them, that will reduce our shadows. Just makes everything look flat again. And from here we can then check to see, like, okay, we got some highlights blown out over here, so we can adjust that. So let's go back into here and see where we're getting highlight blowouts. So if we reduce that a bit more, greens, blue will be the obvious perpetrator here. Alright. Okay, so there we go, we have a nice flat image. It's not too contrasty, and it's a heck of a lot of a difference from what this started out like. And what it started out like was not very nice. So even when you're just comparing those two things, it's a huge difference. And from here we have a nice image to work with, and we can darken it, add our own curves in, we can do whatever we want from here. It's really a great way to edit an image, and it works for me, might not work for everyone, but that's how I do it. Alrighty, and because we removed the sharpening in Lightroom, if we want to add that back in, we can do that easily by going into Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, selecting an area that we want to sharpen. I like to keep my radius 1.1, threshold around 1. It allows me to really dial in that sharpness, so maybe around 113. No, I'm just kind of dialing it in where I think it looks the best, so I think around 113 looks alright. And we can check that, so without width. I don't know if you can really notice that on the YouTube video at all, but it adds a little bit more sharpness to it, and it avoids artifacting when we're going through and editing it in Photoshop. Just to let you know as well that this is how I prefer to edit my images, just because it gives me more control. In my opinion, that's just what I prefer. This may not work for everyone. Some of you might hate this. It's really up to you to decide, and this doesn't work with every single image. Some images require a little bit of a different process, but in this case it works with most images, and it just kind of gives me the control that I want. Alrighty, so the last couple of things that I do with my image once I'm finished up with it, bearing in mind that when we exported this image it was in the color space Adobe RGB, and we want to change that to sRGB for compatibility reasons. For compatibility reasons of most monitors, phones, tablets, they all are calibrated to sRGB. It's only certain monitors that are actually calibrated to understand the RGB, Adobe RGB color space. And if I was to upload this in Adobe RGB, the colors wouldn't look like I'm seeing them right now. They would come out flat, bland, or just slightly different shades of colors, and I don't really want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to flatten the image, go into edit, convert to profile, and change it from the Adobe RGB to sRGB. It's not going to look any different here, but it makes a difference when you upload it. And the only other thing that I do to my image is I change the size of it, so just resizing it. So I usually go 2160. If I'm just uploading the image how it is without doing any of my crop ins or zoom ins, I'll usually use 2160. If I'm not doing just the image by itself and I am doing crop ins, then I will keep it the natural file size, and then I will crop that on my phone using Snapseed, just using the square crop in tool. Other than that, that's pretty much how I edit my photos. Yeah, thanks for watching. If you have any other questions, comments, or anything like that, you can just chuck them in the comments below, or just send me a DM on Instagram. Cheers for watching.